Hello and welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle. And the exposure triangle represents the three settings that we can control on our camera in order to get the exposure that we want. And a lot of people are under the misconception that there's only one set of settings that is going to get you a given exposure. That's actually not true. We can actually work with these three different settings to get to the same point, but we're going to have very different effects. We might have motion blur, we might have a blurred background, we might have a very sharp background. And what we're going to do in this video is just show an example of varying these three settings, ending up having the same exposure, but a very different look to our photo. So with that, I've picked out a boat out here on the St. Croix River. I'm sitting in Hudson, Wisconsin right now. And we'll go ahead and first take that as I normally would using an aperture of f8, and then we will start changing from there. Given the conditions, my settings ended up being ISO 100, 1/160th of a second at f8. And so I'm going to use that as the baseline exposure, and I'm going to just adjust the various settings but end up with the same overall exposure, but we will see that there are some differences in just how some of the other elements in the photo are treated, as well as we will see sometimes vignetting, and that'll be a little bit more obvious than at other times. But the point is that depending upon what we're trying to do, understanding how we can work with these three settings can go a long way towards helping us create whatever that artistic look is that we're trying to get with the photo. It could be separation from the background, it could be wanting to show motion, freezing motion, all kinds of different possibilities. So there's some terms I'm going to be using in this video. I thought it'd be helpful to just talk about them right now. So one, I'm going to be using the term stop, or stop of light. And basically that's a unit of measure in the photography world where each time you increase the unit, you're doubling the amount of light in your exposure, or if you decrease it, for every one you decrease, you're reducing the light by half. When I talk about ISO, that is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. It's a setting that you can put in the camera. Back in the film days, the different film emulsions would have different properties to react to light. And so you had 100 speed film, 200, and this was just carried over to the digital days. But now we have the advantage we can do that from one frame to another, as opposed to having to wait till we finish up the roll of film. Aperture is the opening in the back of the lens that's allowing light to come through. It's a diaphragm that opens and closes, and the smaller that is, the less light that's coming through, and so the darker the image will be. And then shutter speed is how long, in our case, the sensor, or back in film days, the film was actually exposed to light. And it was a curtain that would open and close. Some of today's modern cameras, including the one I'm using today, does not have a mechanical shutter. It does that just using the firmware within the sensor itself. If we look at these two shots, the thing that we'll notice is the exposure is the same in both. Yet the camera settings are actually different. Let's take a closer look at the histograms and the camera settings to see the difference between these two shots. So what you'll notice is I changed the aperture from f8 to f5.6. What this did was it added one stop of light to the image. Reason for that is 5.6 is a much wider opening for the aperture than f8. To compensate for that, I would then need to adjust either the ISO or the shutter speed, or even perhaps both if I wanted to. But in this case, I choose to change the shutter speed. And the reason for that is if you look at the two photos, you'll notice that the boats are positioned slightly different. Yet the photo was taken from the exact same spot. In fact, it was taken on a tripod. So there is some motion there that I need to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the shutter speed by 1 stop. And so to do that, I'm going to take the shutter speed and I'm just going to double it. So from 1/160th of a second to 1/320th of a second. That ends up giving us the same exposure even though the settings are different. At this point, you might be a little confused. For shutter speed, reducing the amount of light by 1 stop makes sense because we went from 1/320th, or rather 1/160th to 1/320th. And 1/320th is half of 1/160th, so it does make sense that that would only be letting in half the amount of light. But why is f5.6 1 stop brighter than f8? Well, let's dive a bit deeper into aperture settings. Just like shutter speed, aperture is expressed as a fraction. In this case, it's f over some value. Therefore, the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. Now, the values themselves are derived from the square root of 2. Now, you may be thinking that's a lot more math than I really want to think about or know about or do anything with. But don't worry, you don't really need to perform any calculations. It's really more for just information. On most cameras, you can know when you're going from one stop to another because it's typically 3 clicks of the adjustment dial for aperture. Now I do show here the actual full stop values. So when we look at this, we see that 5.6 is 1 stop brighter than 8.0. And so that's why I had to make the adjustments that I did in order to keep the same exposure across the 2 photos. Let's take another look at the photo shot at f5.6. The increased shutter speed definitely helped with the movement, but if we zoom in on the boat that's in the background, we can see that we need more depth of field. That is, if we want that boat to be sharp. Maybe we like the fact that it's a little bit out of focus, but let's say we did want it sharper. To do this, we'll need to close down the aperture, and probably quite a bit. So for this example, we're going to close down the aperture to f16. That is 3 stops darker than f5.6. Now we want to keep our shutter speed at 1/320th of a second because that's what eliminated the motion blur in the photo. So the only thing we have left to change at this point is the ISO. And this is one of the big advantages, I think, of digital, because we don't have to make other compromises like we did in the film days where we'd have to actually go to a different roll of film in order to change the ISO value. 3 stops means we would need to go to ISO 800. And the reason for 800 is we need to double the value 3 times from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, and 400 to 800. Now when we zoom in and look at that boat that's in the background, we can see it is a lot sharper. Is it tack sharp? Well, no, not exactly, but it is a lot sharper. One other thing to be aware of is as you increase the ISO, it will increase the graininess a little bit that you have to then deal with in post-processing. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the information to be useful. If you did like it, please hit the like button. If you'd like to be notified about future ones, hit subscribe and that little bell, and you'll receive an email whenever a new video comes out. Thanks.